Hello, it's me again. I really enjoyed filming that first singing lesson for English touring opera, and I enjoyed it so much that I decided to make a second one. And I hope you'll indulge me and watch that one as well. Now, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephan Loges. I'm an opera singer, and at this point in time, I was expecting and hoping to be on English Touring Opera's spring tour, involved in productions of Mozart's Così fan tutte and also a staging of Bach's St. John Passion. But sadly, due to the coronavirus outbreak, that whole tour had to be cancelled. And in order to give something back to English Touring Opera, to in some way repay their most generous decision of actually paying us our fees for those performances, even though we now can't do them, some wonderful people came up with the idea of filming a series of singing lessons. There will be lots of other artists and singers involved as well, but I filmed the first one, and now this is lesson number 2. Now, to recap a little bit on the homework I gave you in lesson number 1, it was a little exercise all to do with flexibility and buoyancy of breath and breath control that we had talked about in that first lesson. Just as a little reminder, the exercise went like this. Yeah. And the idea was that you carry that rhythmic energy that's in those dotted rhythms of the first half of the exercise into the long note in the second half, and keep that energy of breath going, even over the long note, and especially in that long note, so that it doesn't feel like one fixed long note, but rather as a succession of many small, short notes, so that you keep that flexibility and vibrancy of sound and breath going. So I hope you had fun trying out that exercise and found some useful and nice things for you to take into your own practice and singing. Now, just to recap very briefly on breath, I think breath, even though it's super essential to singing and it's quite a complicated process, it should feel easy. So imagine that breath kind of just falls into you, into your body, into your lungs, through an open throat, and yeah, you don't have to suck it in forcefully or feel that you have to do much. Just keep yourself open and feel the breath. You're inviting the breath into yourself. And then on the out breath, which is what we of course very concerned with in singing, you should feel that you can control how much of that breath you release onto your vocal cords to make them vibrate and turn breath into sound. And we talked about feeling that the breath comes from very low down. Now, that's, of course, just a picture. We know that the breath comes from the lungs, which are somewhere in the middle of your body. But to gain that flexibility and freedom of sound, I think it's helpful to imagine that your breath comes basically from your feet, comes from very low down. We talked about that kind of ring of air all around your lower abdomen, or how it feel that the breath comes or goes all the way down into your lower back, and you almost create a cushion of breath that you sit on, so that really you feel there's quite a big distance between where the center of your breath control, so to speak, lies, and where your sound then emanates from. Because I think if those are too squashed together, you will feel that your column of sound or breath is very short. It will feel quite squashed, quite inflexible, a little bit rigid, and that's not what you want. What you want is to feel that length of your spine, length of breath, length of sound. So we always want something that's quite tall, vertical, quite long and free. And that was what hopefully that exercise was going to help you with, but also those images of breath low in your body and keeping it low and flexible. Now, I used 2 other words in my first lesson which might need a little bit of explaining. The first one was the word fricatives. Now, fricatives are consonants that are created by forcing air through quite a narrow space, a narrow opening, and by creating friction of breath, those fricatives, that's where they get their name from. And those fricatives are very useful in learning about breath flow and breath flexibility and breath control. Now, let's take the four main fricatives, which are f, s, sh, and th. And you can tell already when I say those consonants how much energy and buoyancy is in those consonants. Now, each of those consonants also has an opposite, which is a voiced one. So those, the f, s, sh, th, are all unvoiced, so there's no sound, no kind of sung sound to them, but all of them have a voiced opposite. So for f, it's v, for s, it's z, for sh, it's j, and for th, it's th. And the unvoiced ones are quite useful in just little exercises, like you can hold one of them over a long period of time on just an even, steady flow of out breath, like or and as I just did with the s, you can then vary the pressure of breath just to kind of feel what happens in your abdominal muscles and the muscles that higher up in your body within the rib cage and so on, how they have to react to the breath or make the different strength of breath flow happening. And that turbulence and quick flow of air, that energy of air in those fricatives is really useful for that. You can also do it as a succession of smaller, shorter impulses, again very much from your abdominal muscles, not too strong, just a little impulse. And let's say you take all four of them and do three of each, like and then you can vary that. You can use whichever fricative you find most useful, or you can use all of them and vary the rhythm and so on and so forth. Just turn into little exercises for yourself. But the shorter version, where you just use short bursts of those fricatives, is really good to strengthen those abdominal muscles, but also make them flexible, which is probably even more important than the strength. And the long flow is just something to feel what happens in your body, how your body reacts to that breath flow and how you can influence it. Now, the voiced versions are very good to learn about what happens when you then turn that breath flow into sound and how to control that. So you can do, I think I did a little bit of that in lesson number 1. I just repeat it. So over a scale of 3, or a scale of 5, and what you want to create is a really even flow of air, and therefore then an even flow of sound, and the really forward buzzing feeling of vibrancy and resonance. And in order to achieve that, you can, or said a different way, you can only achieve that if your breath is free and flexible. Because if you push your breath too hard, the sound will cut out. And of course, if you don't use enough breath, you won't make a sound in the first place. So that is really, really important. The other word I had used was the word passaggio. Now, passaggio is translations of passaggio. Let me think. You could say passageway, pathway, crossing, change over, little bridge, transition. All of these would be a way of translating passaggio. What it in singing means is the transition from one part of your voice that works in a certain way to a different part of your voice that works in a slightly different way. Now, what we are trying to do is make those transitions as seamless as possible so that our voice from top to bottom sounds very even, sounds like one continuous, homogeneous voice, so that we don't hear those transitions. But anatomically, at least in a simplistic way, just to say that quickly, there are, to this day, very different opinions on how many of those different parts of your voice exist, if they exist at all, where exactly they lie, and where those transitions are. So there are lots and lots of books which vary hugely in opinion and description of those things. But for our sake, to explain passaggio, let's keep it very simple. Let's say you've got three of those parts in your voice. You've got a lower part that is quite heavy, quite thick, lots of chest resonance, and you've got a high part of your voice that's much more heady, a lot more head resonance, much lighter, much more streamlined, much thinner in a way. And then in between those two lies what, let's call it, your middle voice, where you have a bit of both in that. And on the transition from the lower part, like the chest voice, into the middle voice, is the first transition, so the primo passaggio. And at the top, where you go from the upper end of the middle voice into your head voice, it's called the second passaggio, secondo passaggio. And now, very briefly, I'll try to keep that short. In female voices, that middle region, like in a soprano for instance, quite a big part of a soprano's voice lies in that middle region, where you have a mixture of the chest and the head voice. And in a male voice, like in a baritone for instance, like myself, that middle part is actually quite small. It's only about a fourth as an interval, over the interval of a fourth, and lies quite high already at the upper, in the upper half of my vocal range. And as I said, the reason we mention the passaggio is that we want to make those transitions, those points of transition in our voice as smooth as possible. So now let me just show you a little exercise where you can do that for yourself. Again, you have to find where that lies in your voice, where it's most useful to practice that. In some lower female voices, it's probably going to be the transition from chest voice into middle voice that is more problematic or needs a little bit more attention. In a soprano, for instance, in a higher voice, it might be more the upper end, the second passaggio, that needs looking at. And in most male voices, it's actually the whole, it's basically the area between the first and the second passaggio, that middle voice, where lots and lots of muscular events take place and things that need attention. Now, this is far too short a lesson to go into too much detail, but let me show you a little exercise. And as I said, just do it at a part of your voice where you feel it's most useful, where you feel there might be a little bit of a break that you want to iron out. So if I just do a slide up from an F to a C over a fifth and try and keep it in a fairly full, thick, heavy voice, it would sound like this. Now, I don't know if you can hear what happens is that, first of all, the sound goes a little bit backwards when I go up. And also, because I'm keeping it quite heavy, it gets a little bit pressed, forced. The vibrato gets almost stops. So it becomes quite a squeezed, heavy, slightly wide sound. And there isn't much flexibility in it. So what I want to achieve is that it's more even. And in order to do that, I will try and take some of my head voice lower down. So I will start the process of going into a different part of my voice a little bit earlier, which will sound like this. So what I try to do now is start already in a slightly lighter, headier sound at the bottom, and then really carry the vibrato, the spin of my voice and the breath energy all the way to the top. So I try and keep the core, quite a slim but prominent core of my voice, alive all the way through that 5-note slide. I do it again. So if you can hear, I slightly lighten my voice, and then when I'm at the top, I try and just experiment with how much of the kind of center, the core of my voice I can bring back without sacrificing the vibrancy and flexibility of the sound. Maybe a picture that's quite useful is if you imagine a rubber band that you stretch. If you hold the rubber band tight in the middle, you are basically not able to stretch the rubber band. And of course, what our vocal cords to go to the top need to do is they need to slightly elongate, and they also need to become slightly slimmer and finer. That's what happens. So if you release that rubber band in the middle, you can then stretch it, and you will see that it gets also slightly thinner. And you can also, that what you do with your vocal cords, you'll try and take mass, weight out of the voice, and by doing that, you allow the voice to and your vocal cords to vibrate more freely. Maybe they are not completely closing; they're just the edges vibrate, and these are all sorts of things that happen when you bring that, let's call it lighter mechanism, in earlier to iron out the transition. Okay, hopefully have a little bit fun with that. Lastly, as we are already again at the end of another lesson, let me give you a little bit of homework. Legato, very important in singing. Legato basically means to tie something together, to bind something, and singing legato is something that all of us want to do because it allows us to to transport feelings and emotions through text, but without interrupting the sound. And I've just said the important word text. Already to sing a legato phrase just on a vowel is not that easy, because for each pitch your breath needs to slightly adjust, and then if you want to bring dynamics in, that's another thing that will need further flexibility and malleability of sound and breath. But of course the text, all those consonants and vowels, all that work that's done by the tongue and your jaw and everything, that needs to be done, but you don't want it to interrupt the sound. So what we want to, or what might be helpful to imagine, is that text and sound, you want to marry them together, but you have to imagine them as separate entities. Because if you squash them too close together, you just get you kind of chew on your words, or you chew on your sound, and you get something again that's not very flexible, that's more rigid and fixed and inflexible. So imagine text and sound separately. Either you imagine that the text sits quite far forward, so forward tongue, loose jaw, all of these things, so that the text sits quite far at the front of your mouth and your face. And then behind that you have your column of sound, and you're basically inviting the words, the text, onto that column of sound and releasing it upwards. That's one way you can imagine it. Another way would be to think of two travelators, one at the bottom being your breath, and the one at the top being where your words are. And the connection between the two is your long column of sound, which gets fed at the bottom by your breath, and then at the top you add on the words. But it's all within that continuous, vibrant, energetic column of sound. So let me give you a little exercise, and that you can do that as your homework. So you start, take a favorite phrase from a song or aria. So I will take the first phrase from one of my favorite songs, Vaughan Williams' Silent Noon. And I first, again, I use one of our wonderful voiced fricatives, v, but I slightly put it a little bit further into my mouth by using what I call puffy cheeks. So here, instead of having that vibrancy and of sound very far at the front, which would be in v, you put it slightly more central and slightly more into yourself and upwards by using those puffy cheeks. I do it once more. And by doing that, I will learn a lot about what my body has to do to create that continuous stream of breath and then ultimately sound. Now, let's put the words on top, but let's keep that continuous flow and stream of breath and sound and just add the words to it. Your hands lie open in the long fresh grass. So again, once more, I do first the puffy cheek version and then the version with text. And I try to get the text as clear as possible, even maybe holding one of the voiced consonants a bit longer, or using the F in fresh grass a bit more pronounced, but always on the breath, always without interrupting that continuous stream of breath and ultimately sound. Okay, here we go. Low, deep breath. Your hands lie open in the long fresh grass. Ooh, almost got to the end of my breath there. So just play around with that a little bit and yeah, see how you get on with that. That's your homework for this time. Thank you very much for listening and watching, and take good care of yourself. Bye bye.